Hi everyone, it's Lori Langford and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to review how I edit my intentional camera movement abstract images. So these images are so fun to create. I have a video that I'll link below where I give you a little introduction to ICM if you're new to it. It is a shooting technique to create just some beautiful abstract or impressionistic looking images. So let's talk about how to edit these images because there's some tricks and tips that you need to know about. So I'm going to take this image all the way back to import. So if we look at the technical side, this was shot using a telephoto lens. So I was zoomed out to 258 millimeters. So this was a plant and I was zooming in on these leaves. I was at f/16 and I think it's only 1/9 of a second, ISO 500. I did not have an ND filter on, so it was just a really quick movement. Now, as I went through the images, this could have been one that I threw away, but I decided to give it a shot and try to edit it. So the first thing, of course, that I did is I noticed looking at the histogram, I had not much in the shadows or in the whites. So I worked on increasing exposure and whites, and just kind of played around with those. So just altering the exposure plus 0.20 and working on the whites, that spread out my histogram and gave a lot more dimension. The next thing I did is I added a lot of contrast, and that is my number one tip for ICM images. Look at the difference the contrast makes. I don't use contrast a lot in my other non-ICM images, but with ICM, I find that it brings out the dimension that you want in these images. So as I go through these edits today, you'll see that adding the contrast is, I think, the magic kind of editing tool. Now, the last thing that I did with this image is I had to clean up the spots. So if you shoot, especially if you shoot mirrorless, you're going to have probably spots on your sensor. So first you can make sure your sensor's clean before you go out shooting, but if not, you will have to clean these up. And so a quick way here in Lightroom is just using the tool. I can use the clone tool or the heal tool to clean these up. And I like to do, keep the opacity up, keep the feather high, and I'm just gonna, come over and clean those up along this image. And these little spots get a little tricky when they're at the line. So sometimes you have to go over them maybe a couple times. And I'll be honest, sometimes like that, I'm gonna have to undo. Sometimes I take it into Photoshop if I'm having a hard time with it here in Lightroom. So you are going to want to clean up and really look at your image to get rid of any spots. See some more over here. So sometimes it's good to walk away, come back to your image because you will have those. Okay, let's look at some more examples today. So this is a water where I panned horizontally. And this was the image as I imported it. And it wasn't too bad off the bat, but you can see how filthy my lens was or my sensor. And I think this was my lens because I was shooting out at the ocean and you get all that water spray. So this one was at 80 millimeters, f/16, 1/25 of a second, and ISO 160. That is that's kind of a more typical settings for an ICM image. And was trying to just do a panning to capture some of the waves and the beautiful sky at sunrise. So the first thing I did is I did kind of crop it so that I'd get that nice straight horizon line. And then I worked on the spot removal. So I did all kinds of spot removal to the image to clean that up. I still see some in there. It's tricky. I probably need to work on this a little bit more. And then I went to the magic button, and that's contrast. So you can see with this image, I added plus 18. If I take that back, let me move it. Let's go back to right here. And then if you see now the contrast, so it's just popping those darks a little bit. I could have also maybe done the blacks, but adding the contrast makes a big difference. Now, sometimes adding contrast will also bring out some of your spots, so you'll have to look at that. Then I played with opening up the shadows, the highlights, adding some more whites, played around with saturation, whites again, and I worked on my crop one more time. So if I look at before and after, just some small tweaks. You can see removing those spots was important, adding just a little bit of that contrast and brightening up the whites really made this image pop. Okay, let's look at a flower image. Now, this is one of my dahlia images. Now, this one just has a little bit of movement, which gave it an abstract. Sometimes I like to do images that are way more abstract, like this one, where I'm really zoomed in. This was with a 60 millimeter zoomed in on the petals, but this one is just a little bit of movement. Again, at f22, 1/3 of a second. ISO was a little higher because I was shooting in daylight and I did not have on ND filter. So let's go back to the import. And you can see the image was the colors were a little saturated for my taste. So the first thing I did is I did open up the whites just a little bit to brighten it up. And then I went straight down to the colors. So these colors were really bothering me. So I did some shifts with the colors. And if we go to saturation, I moved down the magenta, darkened the greens a little bit. So I wanted it to be a little bit softer. Then I started working on my spot removal. So you can see all these spots, little spots around. So I cleaned up the image. Then I worked on my colors a little bit more. And I actually added a little dehaze to soften it. So I wanted this to have that little bit more of a dreamier look. And so just adding a little bit of negative dehaze, I was able to do that. And then I did make, let's go back, I made a little bit of a pop, actually darkened the exposure just a little bit, -0.15. So this was the before and the after. So this image didn't need a lot of editing. And again, it would be your preference. You may like the really dark, bright colors. Either way could work just fine. All right, let's look at one of these grass images. And let me see which one I want to play with. Okay, this might be a great one. So this is the import. So this was a grouping of green grasses, but behind the grasses were all these fall plants and the light was shining through. And as I played with the grasses, I noticed all these colors that were kind of reflecting onto the grass. So again, the grasses were green, but I was able to get all these colors coming through. Now this was shot at 21 millimeters. I was standing pretty close to the grasses. This was with a Lens Baby lens, which I had on my camera at the time. So I don't have the f-stop number, but I would have taken it up to probably f16. I was at 1/13 of a second. So I actually pasted some settings from another image, but I'm going to just walk you through. So the first thing, one of the first things I did in this image, you can see, is I added contrast, +42. I reduced the highlights and opened up the shadows and opened up a little bit of the whites. And so if we go to the import, we can see there was a little room on the whites and I just wanted to kind of brighten those. So as I brought that in, these were some of the changes that I initially made. I also did a little bit of saturation, so brightening all these colors up. But the biggest, again, is the contrast. Then I went in and did a shift on my colors. I wanted to bring out this aqua color. So when you're editing your ICM images, you're still going to make changes like you do with any image. You're going to tweak your colors. You're going to make sure your exposure is solid, but you're doing a couple extra things, which would be contrast, removing spots, maybe adding some dehaze or clarity. So those things can be helpful. Now, I also did a mid-tone point curve adjustment. So right here, I just reduced the midtones just a little bit in the image. So if I bring that back up, bring it down, it's just darkening the middle tones of my image. And if you look at the histogram, you can see how it's moving as I shift that. And then I tweaked the contrast a little bit and continued to, let's see, I went in and did a contrast adjustment, adding a little bit more and a little pop of exposure up to just 0.10. I always do exposure last. I make sure I've got everything else the way I want it. And then if I want to brighten it or darken it, I can play with that exposure slider. Now this one did not have, I do see a spot right here, so I probably need to go in. And I'm telling you, this spot removal, you will want to look at your images multiple times because you're going to see spots. It's just inevitable with ICM. And so, coming back to your image later, looking at it with fresh eyes, really brightening your screen can help to get rid of any spots that you see. So you will pull up an image and you'll think, I got rid of all of them. And then there's one that shows up. So that can happen from time to time. All right, let's look at one more image. Let's come over and look at one of these water scenes. And see if I can find one that... All right, so this is a really soft, large landscape scene that I shot at f11, 16 millimeter, and I was at 1/20th of a second. And so if we go to the import, you can see the image here. So it wasn't too bad. I had a few spots in it, but overall, I was really pretty pleased with it. And it just gave me an opportunity to play with it a little bit. And so I went in and did a tone curve adjustment. I really wanted to kind of darken this and make it a little moodier. And maybe if I edited it today, I would do something different. Never know. Played with temperature and tint to bring out some of the pink tones. Played with some exposure, some highlights. I did have some white clipping, so I fixed that. Did some color adjustments and then did some spot removal. So this was before. And this was after. So this is more what my eye saw, but the way I shot it, it really just came out very blue and kind of monochrome, but I wanted to highlight these colors that were in the image already. So just tweaking those. Now I did not add contrast to this image, but we can see what happens. If I come in and add that contrast, it's bringing out that dimension in the image. But this image, I really wanted to be very soft. I almost could even probably reduce the clarity to make it even a little more softer. So depending on what you're wanting your ICM image to look like is when you would add that contrast, or you could even take away the contrast. If you wanted to really soften the image, you could tweak that. So those are just some of my quick tips here in Lightroom for editing your ICM images. And they're so much fun to play with, and sometimes you're going to get an image that is underexposed or overexposed, and you can always try to fix it. Always click the auto button first to see if you can save the image before you just throw it out. These images are so fun and beautiful once you make just a few small tweaks to them. They don't usually require a lot of editing. Thanks, everybody.